July 2018 webinar. Disclaimers. We are not attorneys. We're not offering legal advice. When you have legal questions, hire a lawyer. This is the PI Education monthly webinar for July 2018. I'm Hal Humphreys, your host. Today, Apprehending Bail Fugitives. PI Education offers these monthly webinars every month on the fourth Thursday of the month. They're free. They're informative. They're a way for you to get to know us and us to get to know you. We're glad you're here. A little bit about the structure of this webinar. We'll take a break at about the halfway point to shamelessly plug some of our educational offerings. There's a promo code in it for you if you stay with us throughout the entire webinar. If you need to leave to take a call or any other reason, don't worry about missing anything. We keep the recorded webinar up here on our YouTube channel for you to come back to again and again. Oh yeah, while we're at it, go ahead and click the subscribe button on the YouTube channel. Do that now. It doesn't cost you anything to subscribe to our YouTube channel, and it helps us to have as many people join as possible. I'm joined today by Joe Stiles from Bail Fast Bonding in Knoxville, Tennessee. Go Vols. Joe started the commercial bail industry back in 1986. I was still in high school. I don't know how he did it because he doesn't seem old enough to have started a business back in 1986. Joe started Bail Fast Bonding in 1999. He now serves 20 counties and has the ability to transfer service nationwide. Joe's team makes up over a century of experience. He personally has hundreds of recoveries from 30 states to his credit. He served on the Tennessee Board of Professional Bail Agents. If you want to become a certified bail agent in Tennessee, you'll want to find Joe Stiles. He's the first and only person granted permission to host and certify his own independent continuing education class for Tennessee bail enforcement agencies. If you want to make Joe mad, call him a bounty hunter. Go on. I dare you. I'm thrilled to introduce you to our guest for the July 2018 webinar, Mr. Joe Stiles. Joe, if you don't mind, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Good afternoon, Hal. My name is Joe Stiles. I'm the owner of Belfast Bonding Company and the creator of Black Aces Bail Recovery. That was a unit that I started in order to assist bonding companies that I didn't necessarily work for as an agent in doing their recoveries and networking with recovery companies across the United States. I've been in this business since 1986. I started when I was 24 years old after 4 years of service with the military, and about a year's time in working as a jailer here in Knox County.
What branch of the military did you serve in, Joe?
I was in the Army, 101st Airborne, spent 4 years there. 3 years and 8 months.
Fort Campbell.
Fort Benning, Georgia.
Fort Benning, Georgia. Well, very good. Thank you for your service. We appreciate that. Joe, there's a lot of curiosity in the world out there about bail enforcement work. Tell me, just describe for me, because I'm a private investigator. We've known each other for quite a while. I don't do any bail recovery work. Walk me through the bail system. How does it work? What happens? Just kind of give me a thumbnail sketch if you don't mind.
Sure. When a person is arrested, in order for the state to prosecute that person, they must usually, unless it's in absentia, which rarely happens, but they must usually take custody of that individual. And when they take custody of them, they incarcerate them and they hold them in a pretrial detainee status, meaning they've not been convicted of anything. For the purpose of allowing that person the greatest amount of freedom, bail is usually set for an individual. Now, it is not always set in capital cases or in cases where the likelihood of the individual to flee has been determined. But in almost all cases, pretrial release of some kind is allowed the individual who's charged with a crime. A lot of times an individual can't come up with the full amount of the bail, And for that reason, they will hire the services of a professional bonding company. That bonding company will charge a percentage. In the state of Tennessee, it's 10% of the bond plus a one-time $25 writing fee and a $12 state tax. They will release that individual from custody into the custody of the bail bondsman, who is then responsible for securing that person's appearance in court on their scheduled court dates. If that person doesn't go to court, the court will normally issue what's called a conditional order of forfeiture, meaning that the bonding company has been notified that the person whom they have agreed to stand good for has failed to appear, and that the bonding company now has 180 days to produce the individual to the court or to pay the full amount of the bond. If the bonding company can't produce the individual, they can sometimes seek an extension, or if the individual is prevented from attending because of medical reasons or incarceration in another jurisdiction or death, then the bonding company can either seek a continuance or they can seek relief from the bond. Normally, the courts are hesitant to grant relief in cases unless the bonding company can prove that the person's being detained somewhere or the person is deceased.
Okay. If somebody skips out on a court appearance, or if they run, what happens on your end at that point?
The first thing we try to do when we get the conditional order of forfeiture is pull the file on the individual. And the file contains usually a booking sheet, the application that the bonding agent took in the pre-release interview prior to making the bond, any additional paperwork that we have, such as collateral agreements, mortgage agreements, payments agreements. It's basically a jacket about the bonding company's interaction with that defendant. Now, the majority of the time, a missed court date does not always necessarily result in an arrest. The person could have had any number of reasons why they missed their court date. They could have been in the hospital. They could have been incarcerated. They could have, believe it or not, just simply forgot. In many cases, the court will allow us to bring the individual in front of the judge and to reset the court date as long as we stay on the bond. Now, if our initial attempts to contact the individual are unsuccessful, or if they refuse to cooperate in getting them in and either reposting their bond or getting their cases, what we call here in East Tennessee, set aside and the bond reinstated, then it may be necessary to actually go out and take the individual into custody and transport them to the jail. And then you go in front of the judge and ask to be relieved. Or in many cases in the lower courts, the court will simply, relief is just a pro forma matter.
Okay. I think this is where the general public has the perception of a bail enforcement as kind of it it makes for really good TV to go arrest someone and haul them in, chase them down the street or run through their house. Talk to me about what you're allowed to do as a bail enforcement agent if someone has stopped cooperating and you're on the hook for their bond.
Well, the means of arrest are pretty much regulated by statute and explained in the codes and governed by different judicial opinions. To some extent, we have the same power of arrest or the taking into custody of an individual as a police officer would have. The exception or the primary difference is that a police officer may arrest an individual who he suspects of having committed a crime or has probable cause to believe has committed a crime. We are limited to arresting the individuals for whom we're responsible to the court. Now, that may not seem like much of a distinction, but you hear all the time, I have even heard police officers say, well, you have more authority than I do, which is absolutely not true. In certain circumstances, we have different authority than they do. Some of it, if I'm out chasing a skip and I see somebody driving 100 miles down the interstate, I can't all of a sudden chase that person down and take them to jail for reckless driving. My authority is limited to the individual for whom I have pledged bond. So to that degree, we have the right under common law to pursue them into another state, to arrest them without right of extradition. In some cases, that after we've announced and they've refused, in many states, they will still allow us to break and enter their home if we have to, if we know that they're in there. And I tell people this all the time. If you break into someone's house and arrest somebody, you better bring a body out of there. I mean, that's all there is to it. You do not have carte blanche to go out. And this is where the great misconception occurs in a lot of TV and a lot of misunderstandings with the public and even law enforcement and everyone else. You do not have carte blanche to act a fool in public just simply because you're trying to go out and arrest someone who's a fugitive. You have the same responsibility of safeguarding the public safety and also complying with every statute and every law that's in effect in the jurisdiction where you're operating. And that's something that a lot of people don't understand. And that's an old biography of mine that you're reading, I imagine, because I've actually personally handcuffed people in 37 of the 50 states. That's not finding them in jail. That's not, someone else getting them and me going to transport them. I've personally gone to 37 of the 50 states, located my individual out of custody, taken them into custody, and returned them to the state of Tennessee. Now, in doing that, I have worked with literally hundreds of different law enforcement agencies on both the local, state, and federal level. There's hardly any federal agency that I have not cooperated with or assisted or have assisted me, with the exception of maybe the CIA and the NSA.
Right. And we've actually got a question from the gallery. I'm pretty excited about this. We've got a bunch of folks in the room today. The question is, so do you have to work pretty closely with LEO in Tennessee, law enforcement officers in Tennessee, when apprehending a fugitive? Are the relationships typically tense or friendly between bondsman and LEO?
That would differ greatly on the jurisdiction in which you're working. I know jurisdictions where they will their standard mantra is, we don't assist bail bondsmen. And I know jurisdictions where they have officers who absolutely love to work with bail bondsmen. We know more about these fugitives sometimes than they do because we've been working the case. What people don't understand, there's not 3 or 4 fugitives running around out on the streets today. There's literally hundreds, if not thousands, of people on the street today who haven't shown up in court. And as these new methods of release are instituted, there will even be more people not showing up because there will be no accountability for the individual to show or not show.
Right.
The only thing that's going to happen to you is they're going to issue a warrant for you if you don't show up. The incentive for you not to show up becomes greater. So I work well with law enforcement. I can't honestly tell you that I've run across many law enforcement agencies. Now, individual agents, I've had personality conflicts with people just because it's human nature. But I count many law enforcement agents among my friends as far away as Honolulu, Hawaii, to Key West, Florida, to New Orleans, Louisiana. I mean, I have friends in law enforcement agencies all over the country that I can pick up the phone and call, and they know that I'm not going to, if I'm calling them, I'm not going to misuse the information that they are giving me. And I will never ask a law enforcement officer to do something beyond the scope of his duties. And that's one of the things that you have to understand. They're not our conspirators. They're there to assist us and they're there to help us, and we're there to assist them. But how you get yourself on the wrong side of a law enforcement officer is when you go out and you kick in the wrong door, or you go out and you arrest the wrong person, or you start trouble in his jurisdiction that he's going to have to clean up. So as long as you conduct yourself as a professional, I very seldom have had any trouble with law enforcement.
Okay. What kind of credentials do you have to have? Do they vary by jurisdiction? Do you have to have paperwork on you that says I am a registered bail agent? How does that work?
Well, in the state of Tennessee, there are two statutes in which people perform bail arrest, depending on the activities of the individual and the individual themselves. One is Tennessee Code Annotated 40-11-133, and that covers the arrest of the bail by the bail bondsman. In other words, a person who works for the company that bonded the individual out of jail. Now, that person would have it on file an order signed by a circuit court judge in the jurisdiction where his company is located, allowing him to perform all the duties of a bail bondsman, which are execute bonds, appear in court, and arrest individuals who fail to appear. The other statute that comes into play is TCA. And when I say TCA, that's Tennessee Code Annotated. And for anyone who doesn't know, Tennessee Code Annotated is the statutes of the state of Tennessee that have been enacted by the legislature. Are simply references to cases that follow the statutes that explain the statutes or explain how the statutes have been interpreted. So abbreviating TCA 40-11-318, what is commonly referred to as the bounty hunting statute. And that's, I guess, what we're here to talk about today. TCA 40-11-318, the bounty hunting statute, primarily allows individuals who have completed a background check, attended 8 hours of continuing education in accordance with TCA 40-11-401, and has received an endorsement from a bail bonds company to go out and arrest an individual. They must carry with them a certified copy of the bond, an endorsement from the original bail, a pocket card from the Tennessee Association of Professional Bail Agents demonstrating that they have completed the continuing education course. And in some counties, they must be registered with the sheriff of the county where their main office is. Now, that is the law in the state of Tennessee, and they should be registered. Every county should do that, but there's many counties that don't do that at all.
Okay. I want to go back to, you mentioned earlier some of the new methods of dealing with pretrial release. I know the bail bond system has gotten some serious bad press in the past several years as being unduly unfair. We do have in this country the presumption of innocence. So if you haven't been convicted of the crime, you're still considered to be innocent. Talk to me about your feelings on, alternative methods of pretrial release. How does that work, and what would that look like?
One of the things that I've always tried to get across to people about pretrial detention and pretrial release. The Eighth Amendment of the United States Constitution says that cruel and inhuman punishment shall not be inflicted, nor some type of bail imposed. I was excessive bail imposed. Sometimes when I'm quoting these things off the top of my head, I get a little bit of brain glitch. But
Well,
excessive
you're doing a lot better job than I could do of quoting those kind of things off the top of my head. So well played.
I've taught classes on this for years, so the material is kind of old hat. It all stems from the judicial maxim that a person accused of a crime by the state is innocent until proven guilty. If you do not have that as a building block of your criminal justice system, then you basically have a tyrannical government who can simply snatch you off the street and hold you incommunicado for whatever length of time is necessary. And that is repugnant to a free people.
Mm-hmm.
In order to secure the individual's appearance in court, there has to be some kind of imposition placed on him. If there is no imposition, then there is no incentive to go. If there is no penalty for not going, then there is no reason to go. So that's where the bail system came into effect. There is nothing that pretrial release does that cannot be done administratively by the court system now. Zero. There's nothing. Nothing in pretrial release is necessary. Any judge of any jurisdiction may release an individual on their own recognizance without any type of payment whatsoever.
Okay. Is the pretrial release business, is that affecting the bail industry in Tennessee? And this question comes from Scott McLean.
Hello, Scott. If that's Scott McLean out of Maryland, he is also an amazing, I'm sure that's who it is. He's an amazing bail bondsman and bail recovery agent, has been my dear friend for many, many years, and a great shout out to him. And hopefully that is who that is. If not, just know there's another great Scott McLean out there. Pretrial release has not affected us as much as it has in some states, but like everywhere else, it's coming. The Tennessee judges, Tennessee is a very conservative state, and the Tennessee judges understand the importance of the bail bondsman in that state. Pretrial tends to have its roots in more liberal philosophy, which believes in a less responsible society. To arrest an individual and simply say, I believe that person's going to come back because I told him to come back, it is childish to my way of thinking. There has to be some incentive for him to go that is less pleasant than the incentive of going. And believe me, being chased all over the country by a bail bondsman is one of the most unpleasant lifestyles I can imagine for anyone. We have, this is no longer getting on your horse and taking, 3 weeks to travel 100 miles. Recently, as little as last year, I had an individual not showing me. I picked the paperwork up. I found out who his girlfriend was. Her children had a Twitter account. They were Twittering the location of where they were eating dinner at. I called a friend of mine who was in that same town who had that individual in custody, in chains, headed my way in less than 45 minutes. So less than an hour and a half after I sat down with his file, I emailed the paperwork to a friend of mine in South Carolina who had the individual in cuffs headed to me in less than an hour and a half. That's how fast it happens in today's world. Yeah.
And we just got a couple more questions I want to run by. And by the way, Scott says, hey, Joe, it is Scott McLean, your good buddy. So someone just asked, I'm new to the profession. What kind of training should I get? Do I need a criminal justice degree? What are your thoughts on getting someone prepared to become a bail enforcement agent?
The only school that is mandatory is the 8 hours of continuing education put on by the Tennessee Association of Professional Bail Agents. You can, I don't know if I can plug them or not. They and I don't always see eye to eye, but to find out all the qualifications that you need, you can go to tapba.org and look up under schools.
Okay.
There are lots of things that you need in order to be a good recovery agent. Primarily, you need patience. You're not going to learn it all in a day, and there is no, in my way of thinking, no comprehensive 1 week academy as if there were like police officers. I'm familiar with the origins of beabountyhunter.com and all of this great material that you have on your website. A good friend of mine, Scott Harrell, was the originator of that. There's several gentlemen who have really good information out there.
Mm-hmm.
The best way to learn to be a good bail recovery agent after you completed the formal aspect of it is basically teaming up with someone and having them show you the ropes, because that's really what it's all about. I mean, being able to go out and tell someone, hey, you're under arrest and you're going to jail.
Yeah, and the process, there's a whole process that is involved there. And the next question that we have deals with that. Angela H says, "What is your skip search process?" And we've touched on that briefly with the Twitter conversation. I mean, I try to look at witnesses, which aren't necessarily trying to hide from anyone or trying to avoid anything, but you know, social media has been just the most amazing resource. It's fantastic. But what are your other skip search processes after you've contacted the family and made your calls? Do you ever use a private investigator to help you track someone down? This lady, Angela, says, "I love doing the skip social media work for bail enforcement agents." So what's kind of your process for finding someone in general?
Well, I'm sure, just like a private investigator, every investigation that you do is different, and it's tailor made for the individual that you're going after. If you're going after a high profile social media type, you can literally track them through social media or track someone who knows them through social media. If you're going through the homeless person who's out on the street, who's cut off all technical te- technical connections, then social media is not that useful to you. So, and of course, there are certain tricks of the trade that you wouldn't want to just simply reveal on an open thing like this. But mainly, I would say when I was first doing this back in the mid '80s, back before the internet and Facebook, certainly Facebook and all that other stuff, I sat down and devised a certain list of questions that I wanted to answer. And by the time I'd answered those questions, I normally had a good idea where my person was. Something that you want to think about when you're talking about someone, believe it or not, is why did they run? If you can answer the why, then sometimes that can give you a clear indication as to where they went. Now, the why might seem obvious to some people. They ran because they didn't want to go to jail. Not necessarily true. A lot of times, someone will just simply go back home to wherever they were from. When they got in trouble in your area, they'd only been there a short time. They weren't really from that area. They're not really running. They just went back home. A lot of times, people will they just get overwhelmed. They'll panic and they'll go for the first place they can think of, and that's usually someplace that they feel safe. So for me to say, there's not really a pattern.
It's not a defined process, but you've got tools in your bag that you know you can pull out when you see a certain situation unfold.
Oh, sure. I mean, and what I try to tell people a lot of times, what frustrates people about trying to locate someone is they get off on a tangent, and then they develop this ghost person, and they find themselves chasing a ghost. And what you have to remember is that you have to stay with what you know. When you have conjecture, if you can't prove that conjecture, you can allow that conjecture to exist, but you can't rely on it for your investigation.
And the same thing, and since this is PI Education's webinar, and I love talking about the bail industry because it's something I don't know much about, but the same thing happens to private investigators who are out there trying to locate witnesses. And I think the fun part about being a bail enforcement agent is you do the interview and you know the person, you kind of know who they are. You've got a very clear picture of who they are. A lot of times I'll get information from attorneys, and I had a case in Texas not too terribly long ago where this young lady attorney gave me the information on the guy she wanted me to interview. And I just took that and ran with it and knocked on this guy's door. And this dude was huge. He's like 6'7", big guy. And I kind of ran through the information with him. He said, I have no idea what you're talking about. And turns out, and it was an unusual name to me, but turns out there's another guy with the exact same name who lives in a different town. And I was knocking on the wrong door. And then when I talked to her about that, she said, well, I just, thought, if I were him, I'd do that. And I'm like, no. We got to stick with what we know. So that's really good advice, Joe. Scott asks, and I know where Scott's going with this. And I'm curious to hear what you say about it. Give us a little compare and contrast of the cost to the public for cash bail versus pretrial release?
I think or commercial. See, that's another thing. They refer to us as cash bail. Cash bail is not the commercial bail industry. Cash bail is where the individual goes and places the full amount of cash with the jail, and essentially becomes their own bail bonds. Okay. But let's go with commercial bail versus pretrial release. Commercial bail is a self-funded system where the individual who's accused of the crime is the one who's responsible for securing his own release. This would be no different than if the bail bondsman didn't exist and the person had to post a cash bail. If the person doesn't show up, the bail bondsman, at no cost to the taxpayer, at no expense to the government, has to go out and find the individual, or they have to pay the full amount of the bond. In pretrial release, there is no accountability whatsoever if the individual doesn't appear. The pretrial release officer has no mechanism under which they can go out and arrest the person. They have no authority to take the individual into custody, even if the person came in to them. They are not subject to losing their job if they write a person and they don't show up for court. They're not subject to any monetary loss if the person doesn't show up for court, or if the state has to pay to bring them back.
And I think that's where the cost would come in, is like if someone has skipped out and they're not under a bond, and there's not a bail bondsman who is responsible to make sure that they appear, and they have no incentive to show back up, then the burden of locating that person falls on the state. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, the burden of, if the state assumes that burden. The majority of people, there are very few departments that I've come across in Tennessee who have a dedicated warrants or fugitive division. They certainly don't have a warrant or fugitive division for people who don't appear. Normally, it's the initial warrants that come in, or an individual's arrested and that person the state has to go get that person. They usually send warrant officers or fugitive investigators. There's only a few departments that I know of in Tennessee, and I know many of them, where they have a dedicated warrants department. Usually their traffic officers go out and serve warrants when they're not running traffic. And if they catch a fugitive, the guy usually lands in their lap on the traffic stop or something like that. That's entirely different from what we do.
Right.
We're the exact opposite of that spectrum. We don't run traffic or go out and serve original warrants. We have a specific individual that we're going after for a specific reason. And that's the focus of us. And as I said before, the whole purpose of pretrial release is to provide a buffer of plausible deniability between the defendant and the release of that indefendant by a judicial officer, because there is no charge under which a judge may not release an individual on their own recognizance. The requirement of bail does not exist.
Okay. All right. That makes perfect sense. And this is, we're going to get into the meat of what I wanted to talk to you about in the second half of this webinar, but I appreciate the primer on the business, because I think a lot of people don't understand how it works. And this has been definitely educational for me. It is right at the halfway mark, a little bit past. I'm going to take just a couple of seconds to plug some of PI Education's offerings. PIeducation.com is a company that we run, and we offer continuing education for private investigators. We're going to offer a 15% discount to anyone who's in this webinar. It is live today, and I'm trying to make sure I get the thing right. I think it goes to the 31st. It will stop being available. 15% off of any course you want to take on pieducation.com. Okay, so it ends 7/31, 15% off, and the promo code that you'll key in is fugitive18, no spaces, all lowercase. FUGITIVE18 is a promo code you can use to get 15% off of any course at PI Education. We're totally thrilled that you're here today. We're also very excited to have Mr. Joe Stiles with us. Joe is a longtime friend. We've never actually met in person, but we've spent time on the phone. When I have a case that involves a bail recovery agent, I will call Joe and ask him, questions about the business. Joe is a fantastic resource for the PI and the bail enforcement community. He writes for Pursuit Magazine. He writes for other outlets. He's knowledgeable. He's a thoughtful human being, and he's just a good guy. If you get a chance to take a course from Joe, I would definitely recommend you do that. The thing I like about Joe is he's a friendly, affable, comfortable person to be around. I would not want to get onto his bad side. And as I said earlier in the intro, if you want to piss Joe off, call him a bounty hunter. And we've had several questions from the audience while we've been talking about these other things, Joe, about the issue of bounty hunter versus bail enforcement agent. One question says, what was the thought process by the legislation for having bail enforcement agents wear bounty hunter displayed on their clothing? And this is what prompted Joe to write the story for Pursuit Magazine. And if you're interested in Pursuit Magazine, it's pursuitmag.com. It's a fantastic resource for anyone who does investigative work. There are tips and tricks and stuff like that. Someone else, Bill M, says, wearing a name tag reflecting recovery agent or similar wording, in my humble opinion, would be a sure way to alert the skip and give him a heads up on who's coming after him. Tell me how you feel about having to wear a vest that says bounty hunter. And tell me, where did that come from? Why do people call bail recovery agents bounty hunters?
Most people are familiar with the term bounty hunter as it applied to the Old West character, who was a person without any formal authority of government law, but would go out and take a person into custody who was either wanted for a heinous crime or was wanted for escaping or custody, but they were paid for producing that body. And because they worked without the authority of the state, and they traveled from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, and sometimes they employed questionable methods. There was certain distaste among the regular law enforcement officers. Now, the bounty hunter as he existed in the Old West was a true character, inasmuch as that his authority was derived only from the fact that the individual was wanted. Now, that situation does not exist in the bail bond industry. Regardless of what you see on television or you read in the papers, okay? And I haven't, to be honest with you, I don't really have a problem with people using that term. It's kind of an eye roll moment. I have a problem with it being codified into statute as the only term by which we can refer to ourselves, and that when we're doing that, we have to have it somehow emblazoned on our clothing. That was my objection to the whole term. We're not bounty hunters. A bounty hunter's authority exists only because the individual is wanted. We are, in fact, agents of the bail or the bail themselves who are taxed by the court with going out and apprehending an individual for whom we have pledged the appearance of that individual before that court. Now, in the statute itself, where it says bounty hunting is a person, and that's always bothered me from the moment that they first enacted this statute many years ago. And I brought this up to them, that if you were to overlook the grammatical inconsistency of a person being described as a verb, you would still be struck with just how little thought was put in to crafting this statute merely by the grammatical errors that they use. That was my problem with the whole statute, that they didn't rely on anyone who knew what they were talking about to craft this statute. If their whole idea was to bring us in and give us a more positive, more professional image, then they wouldn't start out with using the word bounty hunter. This was crafted by people who don't know what they're talking about an industry that they don't know what they're talking about, but because they have law enforcement background or legal background, they believe that they knew from watching television and movies and reading newspapers what the bill is all about.
Well, Joe, I'm going to tell you. I mean, Joe. Here's the thing. People have seen the show Dog the Bounty Hunter, and they know what this business is about.
You know what? I don't begrudge anyone the opportunity to become famous and make a lot of money. I truly don't. And he is without a doubt the most famous bail enforcement, bounty hunter, bail bondsman, probably in the known history of the industry. But that's all television. That's what he's famous for. Prior to television, no one had ever heard of Dog the Bounty Hunter. No one has still, in the everyday working world, heard of Joe Stiles. In my industry, I have friends in almost every state in this union and even a couple of different foreign countries. But outside of this industry, no one knows who I am. And that's how I like it. There is no famous bounty hunter who got famous from bounty hunting. I promise you. Every famous bounty hunter that you've ever heard of has gotten famous because a book was written about him. He was on a TV show. Something of that nature. There are no famous bounty hunters. Probably the most prolific bounty hunter in our time was a fellow back in the 80s named Ralph Thorson. And until Steve McQueen made a movie about him, no one outside of California had heard of it. And that's just how it goes. I can sit here and name a dozen or so people that in the industry are just as famous as the Chapmans and their family.
And Scott points out, he said, Dog Chapman brought light to a covert industry. Prior to him, nobody knew or cared much about what we do. I mean, maybe there's some good that comes out of the TV show.
Yeah, obviously there were. I wasn't a huge fan of the show, and primarily because, I don't imagine, Michael Jordan watches too many college basketball games, but so, I don't really watch shows about chasing bail jumpers. I've chased bail jumpers, and I promise you, I will put my record of catching bail jumpers up against anyone who wants to put out bona fide numbers. But that's not important. The important thing about the bail bond industry, and the biggest change to the bail bond industry happened back in 1907, I believe it was. Some home invaders out in Arizona broke into a house. They thought they were going to rob a drug dealer. They broke into the wrong house. The drug dealer moved out. They ended up killing two of the people in the house. And it was during that time that we had one of the most horrific times in the bail industry that you ever saw. People were practically begging for us to be hung by our necks. There were stories of rogue bounty hunters roaming the country, shooting people down. And none of that stuff happens. We do carry, a lot of us, most of us carry a gun. If you carry a gun, you can expect at some point in time, you will have to pull that trigger. You can hope that you don't ever have to, just as I hope I don't ever have to, but you don't carry it for a paperweight. It's there, it's got bullets in it. And if somebody shoots at you, you're going to wish you had it if you did. The other thing that you have to remember is there are very few incidents of bail bondsmen or bail enforcement agents or bounty hunters actually getting into shootouts with people. Certainly, if you compare it to the number that happen on an everyday basis with other members of law enforcement, we're probably on the low end of it. Mm-hmm. But when somebody or a gun goes off anywhere near us, you can guarantee that the 6 o'clock news and the local paper are going to have a headline 6 inches tall that says, "Bounty hunters destroy the world." And that's why that name offends me, because no one can point, with the exception of perhaps Dwayne Chapman, no one can point to a positive image being attributed to the word bounty hunters. Yet that's what our state legislature wants us to put on our clothing. And so whenever the newspapers say bounty hunter does this or bounty hunter does that in the state of Tennessee, they're going to be absolutely accurate. That's going to be who we are.
Yeah. I've got another comment slash question from the field. It always seemed like such dangerous work. I always worried about my previous boss going out catching fugitives, even though he was totally capable of taking care of himself. Should you take classes on how to safely apprehend a fugitive? Are there any classes out there that you would recommend someone take to, like, the actual, if somebody's combative and running, are there courses on how to, deal with that situation?
If you're going to take an individual into custody, there are classes that you can take to learn how to properly apply a set of handcuffs to an individual. And it is important to handcuff an individual, if at all possible, in such a way that does not inflict an injury upon them, especially an injury that there was no reason to inflict. An individual who's being cooperative, there's no reason for you to slam those cuffs against his wrists or bust a blood vessel. When you take a person into custody, that's exactly what you're doing. You're taking them into your custody. You should do that to the greatest extent possible with the same courtesy and dignity that you would want displayed to you. If the person's cooperating with me, I see no reason to be uncooperative to them. When a person's cooperating with me, I want to be cooperative with them. Normally, when I approach an individual, I sort of have a routine down because I want to judge what their cooperation level is. I will come up and, in accordance with the statutes, I will announce myself. I will say, "I'm Joe Stiles with Belfast Bonding Company. I have a court order for your arrest. Turn around, put your hands on that wall." Now, when I've done that, I have done several things. I've identified myself. I've explained my reason for being there. I have told them what my intentions are, and I have given them an order to judge their compliance. Now, that sounds like a whole lot of complicated stuff to get to in just that 1 or 2 sentences. But when you've been doing it as long as I have, you learn that if you go in and you start some witty repartee with them and establish yourself on a common level, you will empower them, or you will encourage them to become more resistant to your authority. So the simple thing to do is be matter of fact. You don't have to be mean about it. Just, "I'm Joe Stiles. I'm with Belfast Bonding Company. I have a court order for your arrest. Turn around and put your hands on that wall." If they do, you cuff them and you leave. The biggest problems that I have seen with people who get into trouble when they're making an arrest is A, they take too long to get the cuffs on the individual. B, they take too long getting out of that area. I have no intentions of being in that area any longer than it takes me to load that individual and leave. I'm not a coward. I'm not afraid. I'm not anything. But there's no reason to aggravate an area by standing around and yelling at people or being vulgar to them or threatening them. You should never, ever, ever make a threat that you don't intend to carry out. If you intend to carry it out, then making the threat was just a waste of time. You should have just went ahead and did it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's some of the best advice I've ever heard, for someone going into the bail industry, and trying to become a recovery agent. At the end of the day, if you're dealing with authority figures, be they law enforcement, be they bail agents, um, it's always nice to approach people with respect, and you can be authoritative and respectful at the same time. I dealt with a case that involved some bail agents in Tennessee, and there were a lot of words said in an area, and things got quickly out of hand because people were yelling back and forth and talking instead of just putting the cuffs on the guy and taking him back to jail where they needed him to be. So that's fantastic advice. Got a question. A Texas bail agent was killed last June during an apprehension. It was tragic. Do you wear a ballistic vest daily?
Okay. This will probably be the worst thing that's going to be said on this interview because every friend that I've got that goes tactical tells me I'm crazy for not wearing a vest. I should wear a vest. I got it. No, I do not. The short answer is I do not wear a tactical vest. I don't have a reason for it. I've had a few guns. I've had less than probably half a dozen guns actually pulled on me. I've had knives pulled on me at numerous times, but usually if I get close enough to you, I'm going to take you. You're not going to get much of a chance to get away from me. Now, as I'm getting older, I'm finding that a little bit more difficult to do. I'm going to just be perfectly honest with you. I have had to use help more often here in the last 5 years than I ever did, but I'm closing in on 60, so we'll see.
Yeah, one of my clients is a young buck of a lawyer. He's a fantastic guy. I love him dearly, and he's asked me several times in the past 6 months. He's like, how, man, you're getting to be 50 years old. You sure you're going to be out there doing this stuff for another 12, 15 years? And no, I don't. I don't want to be 60 something years old, knocking on doors and having people put guns in my face. It's just not what I want to do for the rest of my life. But I think the question of protective gear, there's an interesting thing that happens. Some bail agents want to suit up in all black and the visible vest and the badge around their thing and tactical, drop holster and the whole schlemiel. Others just wear street clothes that are comfortable, they can run in if they need to. And I think it's interesting, the people that suit up and go, as you said, go tactical, sometimes that causes more problems than are necessary.
Um, I think I wrote an article for Pursuit talking about the standard of the different uh, clothing styles. I do not know of any clothing style that I absolutely just refuse to acknowledge. I believe, or am against it. Going tactical has its moments. Look, if you're hitting a house and it's what we call a hard hit, we're not talking to anybody. We're not investigating anything. We know our guys in there. We're taking law enforcement with us. We know there's going to be trouble. We want an overwhelming show of force. We're not going in to negotiate. We're going in to take you out of there. Then coming in with everybody all tacked out is sometimes a good idea. It's an intimidation factor. It's a unifying factor. If they see 3 or 4 guys all dressed in different clothes, it does not present the same visual impact as seeing 4 or 5 guys all dressed the same. You can look at team sports; it's the same thing. If you were out there watching a football team play, and they're at practice, so they all have different jerseys on, different colored shirts on, whatever. The force of that is not as overwhelming or unifying as when you see them all dressed in their game helmets with their game uniforms on. It is a visual image. Now, on the flip side of that, if I'm going into a business to arrest someone who just simply didn't go to court the week before and they're not going to take care of it, I don't necessarily want to go storming into an office building with 3 of my agents all dressed in black with riot guns out. You have to use common sense when you're doing this. You have to know your environment that you're in. You have to fit into that environment. I read a story one time, and this doesn't really have anything to do with bail enforcement, But I read a story one time about covering concealment. Yeah, I was in the military and it was part of our training. The way to disappear is to make a person see what they expect to see. And that is the easiest way to disappear. If you blend into your environment, if you become your environment, you won't stand out. But if you're walking through Skid Row in a three-piece suit, you'll probably stand out. In the same instance, if you're walking through a better part of town dressed like a bum from Skid Row, you'll stand out. Now, you may have every right to be there. I don't deny the fact that you have a right to go where you want. But if you don't want to be noticed, then it's best to blend in. But now, I don't have any problem with people tacking out. I don't. I mean, if you want to go tactical and you think it's a tactical situation, I think you should go tactical. My problem arises when individuals refuse to adapt to the environment they're in when making the arrest. That's where I have a problem.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that's just generally speaking. I like the fact that you brought in the idea of a uniform. That's the reason militaries wear uniforms. It's intimidating. If you've got a whole group of people dressed all the same, it looks impressive. It's intimidating. So I can see that if you're going into what you called a hard hit, it's like, yeah, you might want to do that. There are other times that it makes perfect sense. As Joe was saying, if you're going into someone's place of business, there's no reason to embarrass people. There's no reason to make a thing into a thing it's not. These are things just to consider. I do. We're getting really close to wrap up time, Joe. I thank you.
In that case, I want to tell you, as far as I'm concerned, there's never a time to go anywhere with the words bounty hunter on your clothes. I just want to get that in there.
Yeah, and that's what I was getting around to. You were talking about the Old West idea of a bounty hunter, and I think I was trying to get my head around it because it's easy to misconstrue the fact that you're getting paid to bring someone in as a reward. That's not a reward. That's paid for service. And you've gone on the line, the bondsman has gone on the line to, foot the bill for this person if they don't show up. And there's a responsibility there, financial, that someone is on the hook for. The old bounty hunter model was basically the government wanted someone for a crime, for escaping, for robbing a bank or whatever, and they would put out these wanted posters, and they didn't care who brought the person back. And I think back in the day, and of course, I'm a child of the late 70s and 80s, and I used to watch a bunch of Clint Eastwood movies and those old Western movies, and that was the model. Like, somebody was wanted. There were a couple of movies I watched, and I think this is probably not terribly wrong, but like, you'd have 2 or 3 bounty hunters going after the same fugitive, and it was kind of a battle royale. In this case, you got one person that's responsible for the person that's not showed up for court financially, and the person that's showed up for report. You got that one specific individual. It's defined, it's crisp, it's clear. There's no mistaking it. It's, I've got to go get this one individual and bring them back because the court has ordered me to do so. So I think that's a pretty important distinction to make. And, I don't have any real strong feelings about what someone calls a profession, but I don't like being called a private dick.
Yeah. Article how there are lots of things that people call each other amongst their profession that if you have to be labeled them to code, it would stick in your craw. The old, there's any number, especially in the legal profession, any number of occupations in the legal profession have with them their own derogatory terms. The state legislature just simply put ours on our uniform. And that is akin to me I don't know that I would go as far as to say it's having to wear the scarlet letter or something of that nature, But there was no intention by the legislature, nor the people who formed the committee who brought this language up, to make this a complementary term or use it as a term to bestow on us any dignity or authority. They said that they wanted to remove us as far away from any being misconstrued as law enforcement as possible.
Yeah.
And that is the reason that I object to the term, because we are an integral part of the criminal justice system. We return as many fugitives to custody as anyone does, and we work with law enforcement officers. I have a stack of files right now of individuals who are in custody in other jurisdictions that if I had not alerted the law enforcement agencies to their whereabouts, those individuals would have simply been released and gone, and we'll catch them when we catch them.
Yeah. Joe, we're out of time, brother. I really appreciate you taking the time to be with me today. This has been a lot of fun. I want to have you back on again and again. I like visiting with you. For the folks out there in the crowd, we've gone over just a hair. If you get a chance, go to pursuitmag.com and check out Joe's article. You can just search it for Joe Stiles, Stiles. Fantastic piece of writing. It's an op-ed. I don't disagree with it in the least. For the folks in the webinar today, we have, I think we've had some pretty heavy hitters from the bail enforcement agents or industry in the classroom today. Thank you guys for joining us. If you need continuing education, please click on over to pieducation.com. Cruise through our course catalog, find a course that you like, sign up for it, and when you get ready to check out, key in the word Fugitive 18, Fugitive 18, and we'll give you 15% off of whatever course you want to take between now and the end of the month of July. That is the end of our webinar for July 2018. I'm Hal Humphreys, your host. Before you click out, go down to the bottom of your screen and click subscribe on our YouTube channel. It helps us out a great deal, and we appreciate you being here. Have a great weekend.